Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're Sunday, the July 24th, 2011, and welcome to Prism TV. I'm Salah Basalama, and I will be hosting this show for today. Thank you for being with us this morning on our show, Rights and Security. You're live on the internet, live streaming from Ottawa, Canada. This morning's program will be dedicated to Syria. We'll try to explain what is the current situation over there, what are the roots of what we are seeing today happening on the ground. We will also try to understand why Syria is such an important country in the region. Why is Syria so different than Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya? What makes it so specific and so difficult to analyze? And in order to answer to all those questions and many others, hopefully, we have invited to our show 3 distinguished guests who are experts on Syria. First guest that we will have is Fred Reed, who is a distinguished award-winning author and translator. He has traveled to and resided in various Middle Eastern countries, including Syria, of course. He has written many books such as Persian Postcards, Anatolia Junction, and one of his latest is Shattered Images that focuses on the history of militant iconoclasm in Syria, an account which is not only historical but also very contemporary as well. And second in line, we have Mr. Haytham al-Maleh, who is a leading Syrian human rights activist and lawyer. Since the end of the 1950s, he has been arrested many times because of his political activism and human rights. Mr. al-Maleh has become a major player in the ongoing protests in Syria. He has been awarded a number of prestigious distinctions and prizes in the defense of human rights since 2004. Thank you very much for being with us from Germany. And finally, we'll have Dr. Joshua Landis, who is the director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies and Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Mr. Landis teaches modern Middle Eastern history and politics and writes on Syria and its surrounding countries. He writes at Syria Comment, a daily blog on Syrian politics that attracts some 3,000 readers every day. It's widely read by officials in Washington, in Europe, and in Syria as well. So Rights and Security is an interactive program. We would like to remind our viewers that since they are watching live on the internet, they'll have the opportunity in the last portion of our program to ask questions to our guests and in our Q&A session. To help you do that, we'll show you a short tutorial during the program, and that will be the time when we will take a little break and to have you see that little tutorial. I hope you will enjoy this morning's show and that you will find it as informative as enlightening, hopefully. So as I stated before, we will start off with our first guest, Fred Reed, who is with us in our studios in Ottawa. Thank you, Mr. Reed, for being with us, and welcome to Rights and Security in our studio. In order for our viewers maybe to have a better idea of the importance of Syria and a sort of depth and perspective to what's happening currently, could you give us briefly like a timeline summary of the pre-Islamic, the Islamic and modern Syria from the French mandate to the Abbas Alawite ruling of al-Assad, father and son, of course.
Professor Basalama, first of all, I want to thank you and the producers of this program for inviting me. I have to add that I'm feeling a little bit out of my depth. I am touted as an expert, but I decline to wear that hat. I'm a person who became passionately interested in the history of Syria and in its contemporary reality. And I have to add further that one of the key people and introducing me to, especially the contemporary reality, but which cannot be understood without understanding the past, is exactly our distinguished guest, al-Maleh. In fact, without him, I would have understood nothing about Syria. So I have to also confess to you and to viewers that I'm ever so slightly intimidated in the presence of such illustrious, outstanding, courageous, dedicated fighters for the cause of human rights, for justice, and for a brighter future for the country of Syria. Now to your question. How many hours do I have to present
it's a big question.
The prehistoric, post-historic timeline on the Syrian question?
Just to have us situate
what I would say, getting serious for a moment, is that in contrast to, with the exception of Egypt, the other countries in which the so-called Arab Spring is now arising, it's now melding into the Arab summer, and perhaps there will be a fall into winter too. Syria is an exceptionally deep civilization. Second only, I would say, to Egypt. And it's that sense of depth, of historical depth, that strikes the first-time visitor. In Syria, there's not simply one level of actuality, or even two, or even 10. There are hundreds, built one level upon another, one stratum upon another. Syria is, to use the old cliche, it's a palimpsest, a tablet upon which much has been written. And at each layer, we can find something that impinges on the present. So what you're asking me, of course, is fundamentally impossible. Nonetheless, having said that, having underlined the complexity of Syria as a society, I think we can make a couple of other comments, that the nation state of Syria is new. And in fact, we could say that it probably can date its existence from the French mandate, from the Sykes-Picot agreements, which were initialized in 1916 and subsequently applied in the aftermath of the destruction of the Ottoman state. Before that, there was no ethno-national identity called Syria. There was the Balal al-Shams, which is something else, the Syrian lands, and that is understood to have existed since time immemorial, for centuries, and was seen as such. But a Syrian state, no. So this is a new phenomenon. It comes into being as a result of the division of the Middle East, of the division of the Ottoman lands by the British and the French, which took place behind closed doors without having consulted the interested parties. We have to have this in mind. People in Syria were not ever really consulted. Later they were told, we're going to set up a kingdom for you, there will be a unified Arab state for you, etc. But essentially it was a story of the division of the region by the then colonial imperial powers. The argument that I would make, and I make it in my book Shattered Images, is that essentially what is happening today is an attempt by other imperial post or neo-colonial powers to remodel the region in a slightly different way, but preserving essentially the same geopolitical architecture. An architecture of nation states, and perhaps even more weakened than they have been up until now, which I think would also throw some light on the current situation in Syria, which has had, since the arrival of the Ba'ath Party in power, has had, relative to the other Middle Eastern states, a certain degree of independence vis-a-vis the West, although it did fall into the orbit of the former Soviet Union. So these add further degrees of complexity. As far as the timeline is concerned, we can say that there was the French mandate, which was imposed following Sykes-Picot. There were serious disagreements between the British and the French, who would rule Syria. The French finally prevailed, were able to impose a regime against which Syrian patriots fought bitterly, repeatedly, using constitutional and extra-constitutional means. During the war, Syria was still under the control, not of Nazi Germany, but under the Vichy regime, which was a collaborationist regime. In 1945-46, the so-called Free French under de Gaulle attempted to reimpose outright control on Syria, just as they did in North Africa. The results were less disastrous in Syria. There were no large-scale massacres. But, in fact, there were direct French military operations against, notably, Damascus. And if you go in the Souk al-Hamidiyya in Damascus today, you will see holes in the roof of the structure, which are the result of French shelling during the fight for control of Syria following World War II. Eventually, the Ba'ath Party, which was created in the late 30s by Sahaddin al-Bitar and Michel Aflaq, seized power. And through a very curious evolution, this Arab Socialist Party somehow became its opposite. It became a party which was a vehicle for a minoritarian, pseudo-Islamic discipline, or discourse, which was able to install something very closely resembling dictatorship. In fact, why don't we be quite open and say it was, in fact, a dictatorship under Mr. Hafez al-Assad. How he arrived to the presidency of Syria is another very interesting. I don't know if we have time to get into that. But it resulted in a very strange bargain between himself and the leading Shia religious authority in the Middle East at the time, who was the Imam Musa al-Sadr, then resuscitating the Lebanese Shia community. He was seen to be, in religious terms, the most powerful man in the region. This is before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This is the early 70s. The Ba'ath Party has seized power in Syria. Hafez al-Assad is on the threshold of installing himself as president. But he's not officially seen to be a Muslim. And in fact, perhaps at some point in this program, we can discuss the nature of the Alawite sect.
Yes, later on. Yes.
Yeah, so I don't want to get too far into that. Nonetheless, the constitution of Syria is then in play. A majority opinion prevails within the country that the president must be a Muslim. Hafez al-Assad, however, is a member of the Alawite sect. Majority mainstream Sunni Muslims do not regard this sect or discipline as being Muslim at all. Musa al-Sadr, who was then in Lebanon, gave his benediction and said, in fact, the Alawites are a branch of Shia Islam. Ergo, Mr. Hafez al-Assad can be considered to be a Muslim. He then assumes the presidency. And you could say that it's all downhill from there. But it's an interesting historical moment where a secular, ostensibly anti-religious movement, which is in fact taken over from within by a minoritarian pseudo or anti-Islamic movement, I would say paradoxically, highly paradoxical. Yeah. That's not the last of Syria's paradoxes, establishes itself as a dictatorship. And the other striking thing is that on the death of Hafez, just before his death, he, in fact, bequeaths the country to his son. Here he says, my son, take this country, Syria. So we have, in fact, a dynastic apparatus now in force. Right. What is the popular legitimacy of the current president, Mr. Bashar al-Assad? I would say probably close to none. Whatever legitimacy derives from the long succession or the consolidation of power in the hands of a very small, ostensibly secularist elite, but which has at its core a religious doctrine, which is not, as far as I can determine, Islamic.
Yeah. So in line with what
Sorry for having taken up so much of your time. That's all right.
Thank you. Well, this is very precious information, of course. So in line with what you have mentioned as with regard to the minorities, how diverse is the Syrian population and why? How can we explain that? Extraordinarily
diverse. One of the things that strikes you immediately when you arrive in that country is the number of churches, especially in Damascus, where there's a very compact but very large, very well-established Christian community. That community, by the way, I found when I was there, our guests will tell me, right or wrong, whether my impression was correct. That community tended to be strongly in support of the current regime, which they regarded as a rampart against what they called at the time fundamentalism. From that we're to understand, quote, Islamic fundamentalism, unquote. But not only is there a large Christian community, there's a substantial Druze community as well, both in Damascus and in the southern part of the country, which I took pains to visit and to attempt to understand. Once again, we would have to say that these are religious minorities, but are they Muslim minorities? The question is rather open. Perhaps we could get into that as well. And even in the case of the Alawiyin, the Alawites, they, the Druze and the Christians, have all been instrumental in creating the modern Syrian state. In fact, the Ba'ath Party was a coalition of all of them. Michel Aflaq was a Christian. Yes. Al-Bitar, who was later assassinated, unfortunately, was a Muslim. And the cadre of this party are from all of Syria's religious disciplines, including some Sunni Muslims. So ostensibly and apparently, yes, the Ba'ath Party was a coalition group, which was able to bring together the various ethno-religious components of Syria. There's one factor I didn't mention, and that's an ethnic or national one, and that's the presence of a large Kurdish minority as well in Syria.
Yes.
Yeah. So that further complicates the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly impinges on the way Syria is viewed by its neighbors, especially by Turkey, where sensitivity to the Kurdish issue is extreme.
Yes, yes, yes. Very good. I think I think we have we had a broad and very interesting background for our discussion. So thank you very much, Frederic, for all these informations, and we'll get back to you again to know more about the maybe some religious intricacies that are very pertinent and relevant to the Syrian case. So in the meantime, we'd like to now turn to our next guest, who is talking to us from Aachen, Germany, who is Mr. Haytham al-Maleh. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. al-Maleh, this morning, knowing that you're traveling through many countries around the world since you've recently left Syria. So, thank you, Mr. al-Maleh. After now more than 4 months of this nationwide movement of protests in Syria, how do you describe the situation on the ground as a multi-decade human rights activist and a leading figure of the opposition to the Assad regime?
This movement is not suddenly happened. It's basically from long history, from the time when this regime took the power by military coup in 1963. And several times there were a kind of movement through Hama 1964 and through Damascus 1965. And after that, through the civil society movement started from 1978 when the lawyer movement in cover all Syria, then all bars, doctors, engineers, teachers. Beginning of 1980, Hafiz al-Assad cancel all the bars and create a private law to make all the bars follow or under the military or under Ba'ath Party rules, and he put us in jail. A lot of people, a lot of lawyers, doctors, engineers, teachers. This is the basic of this movement now, the basic of the revolution now. Now what happened in Tunisia, started in Tunisia, I call it the tsunami of freedom, started from Tunisia, moved to Egypt, and then Libya, Yemen, and then to Syria. Now, the people started since more than 4 months moving through the streets. It was so small in the beginning. When I released several interviews made with me by several media, I said at that time it is a kind of snowball, and it will be became bigger and bigger through the time. And now it is around 2 million demonstrators, cover all Syria, all cities. Maybe there's 2 cities still top 2 billion, Aleppo and Damascus, but it is going bigger and bigger in all sides. Now the regime take their decision that they want to finish this revolution by force, by military, by security. So they arrest around 15,000 persons in jails, prisoners, and they kill more than 2,000 persons by shooting by security or shabiha, as we call them. And there is around 1,500 disappeared persons, and we have more than 15,000 out of their land now. They are refugees in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and the regime is not able to listen to the people what they need. Always they said some kind of propaganda. They want to win the time. They said we want to make a change. We want to correct something, but in real fact, nothing happened.
We thank you very much for this broad picture of the situation on the ground. We've been listening to you since the beginning of the uprising, speaking to the international media while you were in Syria. So my question now is, why could you tell us why did you leave Syria, and was it by choice or were you led to go in exile somehow?
Yeah, really, it is very difficult to me to leave Syria or Damascus, especially because it's my city. But in my opinion, I have to take this difficult step because I want to go out to explain the situation of Syria revolution for each all over the world, all over the countries. I want to explain for parliaments, for human rights organizations, for every side in the world, because Syrian people, Syrian nation want to have some kind of help from outside. So I started in Istanbul for our conference for future of Syria, and then I started with several cities, several capitals in Europe to explain, to meet parliamentarian, some response persons from Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I want to put them under their responsibility because Syria, as you know, it's a member of United Nations, and the international committee is responsible about what happened in Syria. Now the government, the regime of Syria is fell down. They are going to kill the people. They did crime against humanity crime, and this is must stop. I must stop the bloodshed. So this is my job now in Europe, and in my opinion, after I finish my trip, I will back to Syria to be in Damascus because I am one from the important leader in Syria.
Okay. So, one of the first activities that you've been having as soon as you got out of Syria was to chair the Istanbul conference. So, can you tell us really, is there really, to what extent really is there an opposition, a Syrian opposition, and how politically credible it is, according to you?
I didn't understand that question.
Yeah, so I'm asking you, one of your first activities was to chair the Istanbul conference. And I'd like to know to what extent there is a Syrian opposition. how politically credible is this opposition?
You know, after 50 years of kind of fascist dictatorship regime, all the society were out of their right, were out of their movement. Uh, Also, in political side, they have nothing because it's impossible to work in Syria in the side of political through this kind of regime. So after when the people now started movement in Syria through the streets, and we have we have some opposition parties, even they are not strong enough, they are still weak, but we take our step to make the conference in Damascus, and in the same equal to make another conference for the people outside in Istanbul. The regime stopped us to make our conference in Damascus, and they attacked the center where we want to make it. So at least we built our conference in Istanbul, and we have our paper for the future of Syria. After that, we vote for the council of the conference. We will try to do the best from our side for our country. This is what we are going to do through the conference. We we are going also to make the conference inside Damascus, maybe through before Ramadan. We will have a chance to make it again, and we will see how we can make cooperate with the opposition parties, with all parties, political and famous persons in Syria, the people who are playing in the political side.
Yes. Well, I guess this is going to be, I guess, a very challenging task for you to coordinate between outside and inside opposition figures, and I guess this is a very difficult thing to do. Well, thank you very much, Mr. al-Maleh, for being with us. We really appreciate you having you with us this morning to our show, and I wish you all the best in pursuing your activities outside, trying to sensibilize people all around the world to the cause of Syria. Thank you very much, and see you soon. All right. Well, that was, I think, a great talk we had with Mr. al-Maleh. Now we turn to our third guest, Dr. Joshua Landis. Hello, Dr. Joshua. Are you with us? Yes, it's going to be in line in a second. Miracles of technology. And here we have Dr. Landis with us. Good morning, Dr. Landis.
Good morning to you.
Thank you for being with us this morning to our show from Oklahoma. You are a professor at the University of Oklahoma and a specialist expert on the Syria and the region. Let's start by asking you a very simple question. How did you get how did you come to get such an interest into Syria that it became such that it became your subject of expertise?
Well, I had a Fulbright grant in Syria in 1981, 81, which took me in 82 at the time of Hamas. So I was at the University of Damascus, the big dormitory, studying at the University of Damascus at the time of Hamas and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. I'd been in Lebanon teaching for a few years before that and had grown up in Lebanon. So
right, so we have a common thing that I also married a Syrian too. Uh, s- so my second question would be: how can you briefly explain to our viewers the situation of the U.S.-Syria relationship and how has it evolved in the last 40 years?
Well, U.S. and Syria have been at loggerheads ever since the Arab-Israeli conflict started in 1948. The United States sided with the Jews in Palestine, and Syria attacked and fought against the Jews taking Palestine. They tried to defend the Palestinians in Palestine. So the United States, from that moment, has been an enemy of Syria, and that enmity led in many ways to the situation today because they helped the first coup d'etat and the first military officer overthrow democracy in Syria in 1949 because the chief of staff at the time, Hosni Zaim, promised that he would sign a peace agreement with Israel and recognize the Jewish state of Israel. And that was not the determining. America did not play a determining role in that coup, but it is an important chapter, and it demonstrated that America at the time was against democracy in Syria because they believed that they could get a peace agreement with the Jewish state in Israel. And that has been really the leading element behind U.S.-Syrian relations is Syria's relations with Israel. And America has sided with Israel and has tried to get Syria to sign an agreement, a peace agreement, ever since. And this has led to sanctions against terrorists, supporting state, and so forth.
So you just said that Syria considered the U.S. as its enemy since that event that you mentioned. But do you think that the U.S. considered Syria as its enemy as well, on the other hand?
Yes, U.S. sees Syria as a fascist Arab nationalist state that's for fighting the Jews in Palestine, who are America's leading ally in the Middle East, and this has put them at loggerheads ever since.
All right.
And America has, interfered in Syrian politics and tried to get a peaceful arrangement with Israel and the recognition of Israel, which it's failed to do in the last 60 years.
All right. Since the beginning of the uprising, where do you think that the U.S.'s policy is heading with regard to Syria?
Well, the U.S. is in a very awkward position. On the one hand, they want, and I think will be eager to see regime change in Syria. On the other hand, they don't want chaos, and they don't want to get involved in bringing about that regime change. So they want to encourage. They're in an awkward position because, as Secretary of State Clinton has said, this regime has lost legitimacy, is what they've said. They're happy to see something else take place, but they don't know how to interfere directly. They don't. Let me take that back. They don't know what to do. She says America has little leverage over Syria, and that's true. America's had sanctions on for a long time. On the other hand, America could invade with their army, as they've done in Iraq, Afghanistan, or with their Air Force, as they've done in Libya. That obviously is something the United States does not want to do. It's way too expensive. Syria is the size of Iraq. It's 4 million people. It would cause waves of refugees. And America, if it breaks Syria, will own Syria. So in that sense, America can increase rhetorical action, as it's doing, and help outside organization, the opposition, but it doesn't want to get directly involved in bringing down the regime or choosing who will be the winners.
So to what extent Israel is the main reason for not wanting to crack down on Syria?
Well, Israel has changed its tune. At first, Israel said the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know, fearing that two things would happen in Syria. One, either this country would fall into an Iraq-type instability, which would be bad for Israel, or that you get a weak democracy that would demand that United States make Israel give back the Golan Heights, big hunk of Syrian territory occupied since 1967 by Israel. In which case, Israel would not want to give back this territory, which it's annexed and considers now has settled and so forth, considers Israeli territory. So it doesn't want to see a weak democracy that America would side with against Israel and feel that it has to squeeze Israel to give back the Golan Heights. And it doesn't want chaos. On the other hand, Israel has come out recently and say, no, they're not supporting Bashar al-Assad. They're happy to see the regime fall. And so they have, in a sense, given blessing to the United States to work with the Syrian opposition in trying to bring down this regime.
So do you see, for example, the visit of the U.S. ambassador to Hama as a sign of siding with the revolution and
yes,
and how do you see the impact of the attack on the U.S. embassy towards the direction of the U.S. policy from now on?
Well, at first, Ambassador Ford, the U.S. ambassador in Damascus, had been on the record calling for dialogue between the Assad government and the opposition. Many people in the opposition were upset by this. Many people in Washington, D.C. were upset by it. The Washington Post had opinion pieces calling him a stooge of the Assad regime and so forth. There was a lot of heat on Washington, on Secretary of State Clinton to bring back Ambassador Ford and to take a dramatic, to show that America was on the side of the revolution. And I think this pressure led to them asking Ambassador Ford to go to Hama. The French did the same thing, and to openly declare that they were on the side of the demonstrators and that the regime must stop the shooting and so forth. And and so that led, the Syrian government saw that as an escalation, and they helped along this demonstration. Many Syrians were angry, and it's led to the deteriorating situation as we see in Damascus. It's another step on the way of U.S. siding with the opposition and coming out in that light.
So you've mentioned a few scenarios in terms of what may be the U.S. policy, but do you think that, in what ways do you think that the U.S. is going to not to repeat the Iraqi scenario or even the Libyan scenario? How do you think that may be the most, let's say, the best matching scenario for the Syrian situation, knowing that Iraq is not a solution, Libya is not an option as well? What do you think may be the most valuable action to take for the international community, let aside the U.S. Itself?
Well, I've been, like Haitham Maleh, who you just had on, who has said many times that the European community and the United States should not intervene in Syria, that this is something that the Syrians have to do themselves, which is to sort out their political situation. And that if they don't do it themselves, they're not going to own Syria when the show is over. And I'm a strong believer that he is correct there, that the Syrians need to do this themselves. And in part, you raised the question of the unity of the opposition. The opposition needs to become unified so that an Iraq-type situation does not occur should the regime be overturned, and that you get chaos, you get various militias fighting over the future of Syria. And in that sense, if America or the European community were to invade Syria, overthrow the government, it would open up a situation where you would have no real alternative to the regime. You would have a disparate opposition group. So the efforts we've seen by the opposition to find unity, to come together in declaring platforms, to elect executive councils, is very promising. And that's something that needs to go ahead. And so far, we have several executive councils. We've had 2 Turkish meetings of the opposition, both of whom elected very different executive councils. Meetings in Belgium, there's going to be a meeting in the United States. We'll see how quickly the opposition can come up with some sort of a leadership.
Right. So how do you think that the Iranian-American relation is gearing somehow the U.S. policy towards Syria?
Well, a lot of U.S. policymakers are using that as the main argument, that the The reason America should intervene, they argue, the people who want intervention, is because it will hurt Iran and help Israel. Now, that's a very powerful argument in the American domestic context, and we're going to see presidential elections are in full swing here. So all of the candidates have to come out and show that they're anti-Iran and pro-Israel. So this is going to push America to make stronger statements. On the other hand, it's quite clear that Iran can help monetarily, but it can't help in many other ways. It can't send soldiers. We've heard lots of rumors by the opposition in Syria saying that they've seen Iranians, but I think this is all untrue. Syrian officials said that Blackwater was leading the uprising in Homs, and I think that the notion that we have Iranians in Syria is about as accurate as that we have Blackwater, American special forces in Syria as well. So yes, Iran is an ally of Syria. America is an opponent of this regime. How that competition will lead to greater interference in Syrian affairs is unclear so far. Right now, it's monetary. Both sides are helping with computer and advice. The United States is helping to smuggle in satellite phones and other ways so the opposition forces and the activists can have clear communications, channels of communication to the outside world. Iran is trying to help with shut down that communication, Facebook and so forth, and help with their expertise.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Landis, for all these enlightening information.
If I could make one last little response to something that Professor Reed said earlier about the Alawites not being Muslims. I didn't want to let that go because Alawites believe they are Muslims. They read the Quran. They believe in the Prophet Muhammad. Now, of course, many Sunni Muslims and some Shiites say that they're not Muslims. This is like Catholics who declared that Protestants were heretics and should be killed. And it took many years of violent struggle in Europe before that issue got hammered out and the two sides agreed that they were both Christians. And in many ways, this is a problem in Syria because Alawites say that we are Muslims. Many other people say you're not Muslims. And in fact, the Syrian textbooks themselves, every Syrian public school kid has to study religion. And in their Muslim textbooks, in the 9th grade, it says very clearly that there's only two options for people who do not believe in God. In other words, people who are not people of the book, that they must either convert to Islam or be killed, or go to war against them. So if Alawites are considered non-Muslims, this textbook, this presents a very awkward position for them. They are legally Muslims in the eyes of Syrian law. The Muslim Brotherhood, Bayanouni, has said that he considers them Syrian citizens who are protected by the law. And he's been pressed many times to say whether they're Muslims or not, and he hasn't come out very clearly on that. But he has said that the revolution does not target them. They are Syrian citizens, and they are welcome to Syria. So the question of whether they're Muslims or not, of course, is very hugely important. In many ways, Syria is still in the throes of this religious question, like the Enlightenment was in Europe in the 17th and 18th century. And so it needs to be hammered out, and Syrians have to come to some sort of agreement of whether they're going to separate church and state, or whether they're going to agree that Alawites are Muslims, or whether they're going to ethnically cleanse them and go to war against them until they convert to Islam. And those are, in a sense, the three options.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this precision. You will be staying with us, Dr. Landis, and now we will have a short break during which you will see the tutorial that I promised you to show you.
Okay.
See you in a minute.
To participate in the live chat during a Prism TV Rights and Security broadcast, go to www.ustream.tv/channel/prism-tv. Once on that page,
so how is it going
click
so far?
on Social Stream and then click Check-in and Chat, which will show you three options for signing in. To sign in with your Ustream account, click Sign in with Ustream, enter your username and password and click Login. To sign in with your Facebook account, click Sign in with Facebook. Enter your email address, your password, click Login, and then Allow access when prompted. To sign in with your Twitter account, click Sign in with Twitter. Enter your username, your password, and Authorize app. Once you've signed in, you can have your chat messages appear on your Facebook wall or as tweets for your followers to see. When the box saying Tell Your Friends appears, click Share. If you do not want the chat messages to appear on your Facebook wall or as tweets, click Skip. You're now ready to start chatting. In case you decide to watch at the Prism Magazine live TV URL, prism-magazine.com/prism-tv, then the chat box appears below the video player during live broadcasts.
That's great. Here we are again, back to you, and I hope that this tutorial was helpful for you and that you'll be able to join us through your questions sent through the chat box. All right, so let's now get back to Mr. Fred Reed, who's with us in our studio in Ottawa. I still have a few questions for you. I know you're...
To quote the former President of the United States, bring them on.
Sure. I know you are a very good expert on Iran. So tell us, why is Syria such an important country to have its hands on? Does it have anything to do with this split between Shia and Sunni in Islam?
You alluded to Iran having its hands on Syria.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we could say that.
Okay.
I tend to agree with Professor Landis that the area of possible Iranian involvement in Syria is quite limited. Like him, I don't believe for a moment that there are Iranians on the ground participating in any of these insurrectional activities. More likely Blackwater than Iran. And we can come to that, actually. Who are the shadowy armed groups that the Syrian regime is talking about? Myself, I tend to credit, to a certain extent, that hypothesis. That's another story. But as for Iran, I tried to illustrate that as far as back as 1973, there was a connection between the then one of the leading Shia religious authorities, Musa al-Sadr, and the legitimacy of Hafez al-Assad as a Muslim. Before that, there were grave doubts. So we have to make a distinction between what the Syrian textbooks say today and what opinion would have been in 1973 in Syria about the question of, are the Alawiyin Muslims or not? I'm not saying I don't think they are. I'm agnostic on that question. But my own observation with regard, if we can open a parenthesis here, is that Islam is strictly monotheistic, very strictly, posits a single God, whereas the esoteric doctrine of the Alawite sect posits a trinity. So that is at odds with what is generally seen to be mainstream Islamic doctrine.
You said Trinity,
A
which
trinity,
is
a trinity.
composed of?
Composed of three persons who have planetary equivalents, which harks back actually to a very ancient sect in the Middle East, that of the Sabaeans, who are mentioned in the Quran, by the way, but it's not clear whether it's the same. This may be becoming too abstruse for our viewers. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But nonetheless, this is during the time of the Shah, 1973, where Shiism recognizes Alawism, if we can call it that, as a section of Islam, and probably of Shia Islam. The Islamic Revolution has not taken place, but Musa al-Sadr was close to Khomeini, close to his circle, and in fact was even before then seen as a supporter of the upcoming Islamic movement in Iran against the imperial regime. Mm-hmm. Islamic Revolution seizes power in 1979, consolidates its power in 1980. In 1982, an uprising breaks out in Hama. The revolutionaries in Hama, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, somehow expected that Iran would rally to their support. Mm-hmm. It did not. It instead supported the Syrian regime. Didn't openly say we endorse the dreadful repression that took place. They did not do that. But they did not come to the support of the people of Hama. That was an extremely bitter lesson, actually, for the Syrians. And since that time, there has, in fact, been a close alliance, I would say a geopolitical, political alliance, with Iran and with Syria. Syria is a secularist regime, at the heart of which is a putatively Muslim subgroup, Alawites. Iran is an officially Shia regime, the only official Shia regime in the world today. So these are strange bedfellows. When the first Gulf War broke out, Iran took the side of, rather Syria defended Iran against Saddam Hussein, we'll recall. This was a great disappointment to those who wanted to get rid of, who wanted to support Saddam, especially the Western coalition, because Syria was actually instrumental in preserving Iran from the Iranian attack, from the Iraqi attack. So both owed each other, in political terms and in terms of military support, a serious debt. Those relationships have been almost unchanged up until the present day. They have seen, each one has seen the other as a crucial ally in the rejection front. And here I agree entirely with Professor Landis in singling out the existence of the State of Israel, the Zionist project, as being the bone of contention, the heart of the matter, actually. The official position of the Islamic regime in Iran after the Islamic Revolution was to say, cut off relationship with Israel, declare it to be illegitimate, and to combat it via third parties, never directly.
But do you
something that we haven't yet mentioned, excuse me if I could just continue a little bit, is Lebanon, which is also crucial to Iran's view of its interests in the Middle East.
Yes.
Crucial to its concept of what political Islam might be in an Arab-speaking country through Hezbollah, and also as a way of maintaining pressure on Israel, making it sure that any Israeli intervention in Syria would have grave consequences for it. So the situation becomes far more complex than first meets the eye. Yes, there's a long-standing political alliance. Yes, there is some military cooperation, although I would argue that it's not conclusive. And then there's the question of Lebanon.
Yeah, in terms of, but do you see an interest for Iran to like have a like a faith-based geostrategic corridor between Iran and Lebanon? I mean,
well, I don't see Syria as being faith-based in the slightest. Not whatsoever. I've tried to argue up until now that it's a political equation and not a faith-based equation. I'm not certain to what extent Hezbollah is a tributary to Iran. People say, oh, it's simply an Iranian puppet. I disagree vehemently with that. Needless to say, they will put up posters of Mr. Ali Khamenei, the self-appointed supreme guide, but they must do that in order to receive a certain amount of funding. But this is an indigenous Lebanese political force, which has a strong military wing. Yes, it's getting support from Iran, but unless it has a wide base of popular support in Lebanon, it can't exist.
So how far do you think Hezbollah can go as an ally of Syria, of the Syria's regime?
It would be, I think, close to devastating for the current regime to fall in terms of Hezbollah's interests, but not annihilating. But we can see that the attention paid to the question of Lebanon through the Hariri Tribunal is definitely also playing a role in events in Syria. Syria, as you will recall, was first accused of being behind the hit on the late Rafik Hariri. Then another alleged perpetrator was found, and then finally a third group of alleged perpetrators. All of this has about it the appearance of political manipulation rather than the pursuit of justice. I'll leave it at that. But getting back to what Professor Landis said, I do agree with him almost entirely that somehow the node of the question is Israel.
Another key player, just to finish with that, because we're going to go to our Q&A session in just a couple of minutes. Could you tell us, another key player is Turkey here. What can you tell us about Turkey's stance towards the Assad regime? Do you think that it's going to turn its back, I mean, more frankly towards that regime, and how far do you think it could go in terms of opposing that?
Well, look, Professor Basalama, they've done that already. The foreign policy of the Erdogan government, and this dates back to almost the very beginning when Ahmet Davutoğlu is first advisor to Recep Tayyip Erdogan and now foreign minister, is to have zero problems with our neighbors. And one of the first things they did with regard to Syria is open the border, institute, in effect, a common market, make it extremely easy for Turkish investors to have access to the Syrian market, and vice versa, to solve the very serious question of water rights for Syria, which the previous regime in Turkey was tending to use as a way of political blackmail. All of those things would tend to indicate that the original position of the Turkish government was to facilitate as much as possible normalization of relations, and they did it. My understanding from what I'm getting from Turkish sources is that there's bitter disappointment at the highest levels of the Turkish government now about the Assad's regime's failure somehow to make good on its undertakings. They have repeatedly made, first, very gentle political statements saying we think that you should undergo a process of reform rapidly so that this doesn't deteriorate. I can understand the Turks very well. They do not want a second Iraq on their border at all. Having had a first Iraq on their border, now a second one in Syria would be devastating and a serious blow economically. Plus, it would somehow exacerbate the Kurdish question. So there are many reasons why, for Turkey, there's, I think, a profound sense of disappointment that undertakings probably given to them, they thought in good faith, the Syrian regime, have not been followed through. I think we could say that their own concerns about Turkish security are, of course, overriding. And when it comes to that, I believe that now they're prepared to see a shift in the nature of the regime in Syria, having gone as far as they can in trying to convince Bashar al-Assad to make concessions. Clearly, he or people around him are not doing it. So they will have said, well, we're going to cut our losses, and we're going to try to bring about a shift there.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Reed, for those precisions. Now we're going to turn to our Q&A session. Don't go away, dear viewers, because it's your turn now, and that's time for you to ask your questions to our distinguished guests, either to Mr. Reed next to me, or to Dr. Joshua Landis from Oklahoma, who's still with us through Skype. Maybe our first question, I don't know to who it is addressed, but it says, could dialogue between the current government and the opposition result in positive change? Or do you think regime change would be the only solution? Maybe Dr. Landis, you could try that one, please.
Well, that's the big question today, and many people in the opposition believe that only regime change is the answer. Many others don't believe that, and the regime has in fact opened the door to dialogue. Now, they haven't taken that dialogue very seriously. Many of the opposition people say it's just a way to weaken the opposition, try to split them and so forth. But what we are likely to see, if in fact the Syrian opposition grows in strength and power, is that the regime will begin to move towards more serious efforts at dialogue. And President Assad just promised yesterday that by the end of this year there is a new roadmap put forward, but that the Constitution would be rewritten in many parts, that Article 8, which establishes the Ba'ath Party as the major political force in the country, would be rewritten. Now, I don't, for a second, believe that Assad wants to give up power. The way he framed this new roadmap was very much in terms of his father's corrective movement. So clearly he believes that he will be president and the Assad family will be ruling Syria when this dialogue process is finished. Many people in the opposition do not want that. They believe the regime is broken and that the problem is the Assad family. So how that is going to be hammered out, how that can be moved forward, is unclear at this point. Many Syrians are still hoping, however, that there doesn't have to be regime change. They fear regime change. They believe it might bring violence, and that the opposition is not ready to take over from the country, and better to have reform of this regime than the collapse of the regime.
Okay, thank you very much. Any comment on that one, Mr. Reed?
I think that's an eloquent and accurate summary of the current reality.
Okay. So do you think that the part of the opposition that is trying to that is absolutely not willing to deal with any possible change that is going through the propositions that were made by Bashar al-Assad. Do you think that this radical stance of the opposition is totally irrelevant, foolish?
No, there's been 40 years. I mean, the reason that many people in the opposition say this is that since 1970, the Assad family has ruled Syria, and they've ruled it in a very narrow fashion. Hafez al-Assad, if you will, came to power. Syria was a banana republic before he came to power. There had been coups every year, every 2 years since independence. About 20 coups or attempted coups, so forth. He brought stability to Syria by putting into place a very small elite at the top of Syria that was based first and foremost on family, the brother, head of security, cousins, in economy. There's a division of labor within the family. And then based it on the Alawite sect, and ultimately with alliances with the Sunni business community, the Druze, Ismailis, other groups, and the countryside in particular was given a lot of privilege, and the urban elites were attacked. Now, that coalition it hasn't collapsed, but it's frayed, and the countryside people in particular, we've noticed in this uprising, have come out against the regime. They don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have much of a future. So that very small elite based on family, religion, these alliances, it's hard to see how it can be democracy and still preserve this small group at the top. And the opposition is asking for democracy. They want to get rid of that small group at the top. So the notion that that small group can somehow open up and give them, I guess what many Syrians want is they want Bashar al-Assad, to become in a sense like a king and have a parliament that would allow for political parties to work underneath him. Whether that is possible, it would require some major changes. It would require Syria not being a republic. It's very hard to see how we get from here to there, to allow for authority and unity to continue with Assad in power, but for some kind of freedom and political pluralism underneath him. And that's a very difficult thing to imagine.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thought anyways. I just got the second question from our viewers, who's, I think, reminding us that we're speaking here from Canada. So the question is, what is Canada currently doing about the situation in Syria, and what should Canada's role be, if any? Maybe I can turn here to my guest, Fred Reed, to answer this question, as he is Canadian.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
I would say, given the current government of Canada, that the best that Canadians as a whole could hope for is that they don't do anything. Keep as far away from that as they possibly can. Refrain from giving their support to any faction in Syria, which of course would be the kiss of death to the credibility of that Syrian faction. The Harper government is an absolutely dedicated ally of the State of Israel, even more so than the United States, if that's conceivable. Israel's primary spokesperson in the international community. And any Canadian position on events in the Middle East are seen through that particular prism. So any official Canadian stance on the question of Syria would, in my view, be extremely suspect, would have to be seen in that light, and Canadian citizens, especially those who are determined to help people in Syria realize whatever their dream of improvement of their national status might be, would say to the Canadian government, please keep away from us. Don't try to shake our hands. We don't want your money. We don't want your advice. Go home. Stay home. Go away.
So what do you think the Canadian people could do to support the Syrian population?
One of the things that has to be done in Canada is for reasonably objective, unbiased information to reach citizens. We have this problem all throughout North America. In the United States, perhaps even worse than here. Professor Landis has mentioned the Washington Post, which of course is extremely close to IPAC and the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy, which would indicate to what extent political discourse in the United States is controlled by certain interests. And the same thing applies here. So citizens have a serious obstacle in being able to obtain reasonable information about events in Syria. I hope that the Syrian opposition, internal or external, when it addresses itself to the world at large, takes pains to try to do that in a direct manner to citizens of other countries and not rely excessively upon Western media. Mm-hmm. There are only so many Robert Fisks to tell the story straight. Too many hacks and flacks, too many Murdochites, too many people working for Rupert Murdoch and his media empire for us to be able to get the straight dope. So I'm not terribly optimistic, actually. Okay. If you're a Canadian citizen and you're watching events in Syria, keep asking questions, do your research online, visit as many websites and find out on all sides what people are saying. Okay. Test your hypotheses, double test them, verify them.
All right, thank you for those precious advices. And maybe we can turn now to Dr. Landis for our third question that I just got right here from our viewers, who's asking how are social media and traditional media playing a role in the situation in Syria, and to which extent the censorship has a negative impact on the uprising?
Social media has been huge. Traditionally, Syrians in exile or in America and the West have been completely cut off from Syrians within the country. And when people like al-Maleh left the country or were sent to exile, they never got home again, and they had very little impact on what was happening at home. The YouTube, Facebook, internet has connected those two worlds, and people like you and this program, for example, have an impact because they're being seen in places like Syria. They're seen all over the world. And as we've seen with the YouTube and the cell phone, it's really like the six-shooter in the Old West. It's an equalizer. It allows every young Syrian to copy what the police are doing and what the authorities are doing. And when they treat them badly, they can put it on TV and they get it all over the world, and people have been horrified and mobilized because of that. 4 months ago, Syrian youth were depoliticized. They didn't know much about politics and they believed it was better to stay out of it. Today, every young Syrian is mobilized, they're on the streets and they're talking politics. And that's in no small part because of new social media, internet, and so forth, which has been able to bring them together and link them to this.
So what about the censorship? Do you think that it is still playing a role over there with regard to the uprising?
Of course it is. And the state is now, the Syrian regime is trying to control. In the beginning of this, first 3 months, they lost the media battle completely. And they really made no effort to get out their story, and they allowed the opposition to completely dominate. And today, most of the foreign press, the Arab press, is very sympathetic to the opposition. They're working with the opposition, and they're not at all sympathetic to the Syrian regime. Now that's a big failure of the Syrian regime's part, and they're trying to, in a sense, come back a little bit by cutting off social media in Syria, although Facebook and internet are still active, but in hotspots, they do cut it off. They've searched out all these cell phones, the special satellite phones that the U.S. and others have helped to smuggle in, and the Syria is taking it very seriously, and they're trying to crack down and censor everything that's coming out of the country.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Landis. And this is how we are reaching the end of our show for today. I'd like to thank very much our guests, Dr. Landis from Oklahoma, and Mr.
Thank
Fred
you.
Reed here with us in Ottawa. Thank you very much for being with us this morning, and I'd like to thank our viewers for being interacting with us this morning through their very interesting questions. And I hope you enjoyed the show, that it was informative for you, that it was enlightening, helping you to understand better the situation in Syria and maybe act upon what you heard today. Thank you also I'd like to welcome you next time to our next show of Rights and Security on Prism TV. And I thank you very much. This is Salah Basalama speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.